In the middle of the Warring States period, a man in the region of Ming worked as a minor clerk in a lacquer tree orchard. His job was insignificant, managing the cultivation of trees and the production of lacquerware. Yet he eventually walked away from these official duties and never held public office again. He was desperately poor. There were days he could barely afford to eat, forcing him to beg others for grain. He wore coarse clothing covered in patches, and his sandals were so worn out that his toes peeked through the leather. Yet, when the king of Chu offered him a mountain of gold to enter the royal court, he refused. He famously declared that he would rather be a turtle, dragging its tail through the mud, than a sacred beast trapped in a royal temple. This eccentric figure was Zhuangzi. History preserves scant information about his life. The historian Sima Qian wrote only a brief biography, noting his name was Zhou, and his origin was Ming. He lived roughly between 369 and 286 BC. His ancestors were once aristocrats of the Song state, but by his generation, the family wealth had completely dissolved. What makes Zhuangzi truly exceptional is his radical defiance of convention. Confucius fought against the impossible. Mencius marched forward even against a nation of enemies. Mozi endured endless physical suffering to benefit the world. But Zhuangzi looked at the chaos and offered a profound insight. He argued that the sickness of the world did not come from doing too little, but from doing too much. The harder humans try to save, regulate, and transform society, the further they drift from the natural state of existence. Therefore, he chose a completely different path. He did not seek to save the world, but to save his own soul. He did not fight the world, but became one with the universe. Zhuangzi did not create this philosophy out of thin air. He inherited and expanded the teachings of Laozi. However, while Laozi focused on political philosophy, teaching rulers how to govern through non-action, Zhuangzi shifted the focus entirely to the philosophy of life. He taught the individual how to find absolute inner peace in a violent and fractured world. A first encounter with the Book of Zhuangzi might evoke the impression of a collection of fairy tales rather than a work of philosophy. The surviving Book of Zhuangzi contains 33 chapters, divided into inner, outer, and miscellaneous sections. The 7 inner chapters, including themes of wandering in absolute freedom and unleveling all things, are widely believed to be written by Zhuangzi himself. The rest were likely compiled by his disciples. The defining characteristic of this entire text is the parable. Zhuangzi noted that 9 out of 10 chapters in his book are written as allegories. He never lectured with rigid posture like Confucius, nor did he argue aggressively like Mencius. Instead, he bypassed formal discourse entirely, engaging his audience through narrative, shifting their perspectives before they even realized a philosophical truth had been delivered. This was his mastery. He used narrative to dissolve dogma, employed irony to release societal anxiety, and gently guided the mind into a realm of pure intellectual liberation. The first is the parable of wandering in absolute freedom. Zhuangzi opens with a cosmic transformation. A giant fish named Kun metamorphoses into a massive bird named Ping, soaring tens of thousands of miles into the heavens to migrate south. From the forest below, a cicada and a young dove laugh at him, arguing that their short flights from tree to tree are more than enough, questioning why anyone would ascend to such an unattainable altitude. Zhuangzi was not merely praising the great or mocking the small. His profound point was that the scale of existence dictates the compass of knowledge. The tiny creatures of the forest live within a brief horizon. They cannot fathom the cosmic depth required to sustain large wings. Therefore, when an individual cannot comprehend a choice beyond their own horizon, mockery only reveals their own limitation. It is not a matter of superior wisdom, but a fundamental difference in the altitude of life. The second is the parable of the dexterous butcher. In this famous narrative, Kuk Ting dissects an ox for Lord Wenhui. Every touch of his hand and movement of his feet is in perfect rhythm, turning a bloody chore into a sacred dance. When the amazed Lord praises his unbelievable skill, the cook lays down his knife and replies that his pursuit is not mere technique, but the way which transcends skill. He explains that when he first began, he saw only a whole ox. Years later, he no longer saw the animal as a solid mass, but perceived only the natural makeup and the hidden openings between the joints. By inserting a blade without thickness into these wide interstices, The knife glides through effortlessly. As a result, his weapon has been used for 19 years and has cut up thousands of oxen. Yet the edge remains as sharp as if it just came from the grindstone. This story reveals a foundational concept in Chinese thought: the evolution of skill into the absolute way. When human action aligns perfectly with the natural order, it transcends struggle and enters a state of effortless flow. The contradictions, conflicts, and obstacles of human life are identical to the complex joints of an ox. To fight them with brute force only dulls the spirit. True wisdom lies in understanding the hidden texture of the world, navigating the gaps without resistance, and preserving one's inner peace entirely unharmed. The third parable is the butterfly dream. Unleveling all things concludes with the most romantic and unsettling dream in Chinese history, the butterfly dream. Zhuangzi once dreamed he was a butterfly, flitting and fluttering around, joyful and entirely at ease. He was entirely unaware of his human identity as Zhuangzi. Suddenly he awoke, finding himself solid and unmistakably human again. At that moment he fell into deep confusion. Was it Zhuangzi dreaming he was a butterfly? Or was it a butterfly dreaming it was Zhuangzi? Zhuangzi identified this dissolving of boundaries as the transformation of things, the universal melting of the self into the cosmos. He did not wish to push humanity into cold nihilism, but sought to release the mind from its desperate obsession with a rigid reality. 2,000 years later, this ultimate inquiry into dream and reality became the very soul of the grandest masterpiece in Chinese literature. The Dream of the Red Chamber. The author Cao Zueqin inherited this exact cosmic vision. The epic narrative leaves the reader with a perpetual question. Was the life of Jia Baoyu a tangible reality? Or was it merely the dream of a mythical stone resting beneath a desolate peak? The novel captures this paradox in its most famous verse, stating that when falsehood is taken for truth, truth becomes falsehood. And when nothingness is mistaken for existence, existence becomes nothing. At the conclusion of the epic, Jia Bao dons a crimson cloak, bows silently to his father in a boundless landscape of white snow, and vanishes forever into the spiritual realm. At that precise moment, the distinction between the mortal man and the sacred stone, between prosperity and ruin, completely dissolves. This is the supreme literary manifestation of Zhuangzi's transformation of things. Cao Zueqin used the tragic rise and fall of a great clan to answer the butterfly dream of antiquity. Life is a dream, and a dream is life. When an individual ceases to obsess over the separation of the real and the illusory, they achieve true liberation. The absolute core of Zhuangzi's philosophy is the concept of equalizing all things, which recognizes that everything in the cosmos is inherently unified and equal. No single entity is inherently superior to another, and one's perspective holds no monopoly on absolute truth. What is perceived by one as truth may be dismissed by another as falsehood, and what is condemned in one corner may be celebrated in another. There is no supreme arbiter to decree whose standard is absolute. In Unleveling All Things, Zhuangzi illustrates this with a brilliant metaphor of a keeper of monkeys distributing acorns. When the keeper offered 3 in the morning and 4 in the evening, the monkeys were infuriated. But when he reversed the offer, promising 4 in the morning and 3 in the evening, the monkeys were delighted. The total quantity remained identical. Yet the emotions of the monkeys were entirely manipulated by the order of the presentation. Zhuangzi's insight cuts far deeper than a simple fable about animals. He exposes a fundamental human vulnerability, revealing how humanity is utterly controlled by language and artificial categories. There is no essential difference between 3 in the morning and 4 in the evening, versus 4 in the morning and 3 in the evening. But because different names are applied, human beings experience wildly different emotional reactions. Humanity falsely assumes it is making objective, rational judgments, while in reality, it is merely manipulated by words. Concepts like righteousness, ritual, right and wrong. How many of these are simply linguistic illusions, differing only in phrasing, yet conjuring the myth of a profound distinction? This insight leads directly to the dissolution of right and wrong. The most enduring friction in human society stems from the illusion of absolute judgment. The Confucian school declares that benevolence is the absolute path. The Mohists argue for universal love, and the followers of Yangzhu insist on pure egoism. They debated for centuries, and yet no one triumphed, because the debate itself was the error. Within the confines of an ego, an individual is eternally justified. But the moment one steps outside of that subjective boundary, every single truth reveals itself as relative. Zhuangzi was not suggesting that reason should be abandoned. He was warning humanity never to absolutize any single truth. If equalizing all things defines how Zhuangzi perceived the world, then wandering dictates how he lived within it. The essence of this wandering lies in what he called unconditioned freedom. To rely on external things is to be enslaved by them. To depend on an external vessel for movement is to surrender freedom to that vessel. To require the approval of society for happiness is to hand that happiness over to the judgment of others. The confinement of human existence stems entirely from dependency on conditions. Even the massive pang, soaring tens of thousands of miles into the heavens, is not truly free, because it must wait for the wind to lift its giant wings. Lizzie could ride the wind with miraculous grace, yet Zhuangzi observed that he remained bound by the very air that carried him. True freedom is not measured by the altitude of flight, but by the complete absence of dependency. In wandering in absolute freedom, Zhuangzi proclaimed that one can ride the true nature of heaven and earth, master the changing elements, and journey through the infinite. What is left to depend upon? This state is achieved through three deep abandonments: the dissolution of the ego, the transcendence of merit, and the disregard for fame. By emptying the self entirely, an individual becomes immune to the friction and injuries of the world. This is far from a passive escape from reality. Instead, it represents an intensely lucid way of living. Recognizing that power and fame are transient means one is never burdened by them. Understanding that right and wrong are relative means one is never trapped by debate. Realizing that life and death are natural transformations means one is never paralyzed by the fear of mortality. Such a life is what Zhuangzi envisioned as the ultimate journey of absolute freedom. The human world is the most realistic text among the inner chapters, confronting how an individual survives within a chaotic world. To convey this truth, Zhuangzi stages a fictional dialogue between Confucius and his disciple, Yanhui. When Yanhui expresses his ambition to serve the state of Wei and reform its tyrannical ruler, Zhuangzi uses the voice of Confucius to deliver a stark warning. To believe that sheer reason can persuade a tyrant, or that moral superiority can guarantee safety, is a dangerous illusion. In the presence of absolute power, exalted virtue is fatal. Confronted with this survival dilemma, he looks inward, offering the answer through the fasting of the mind. This is not a physical ritual, but a total clearing of obsessions, prejudices, and all moral righteousness. As Zhuangzi wrote, an empty room channels the light, and stilling the mind anchors blessings. Only a mind thoroughly emptied of dogma can harbor true wisdom. One must abandon the illusion of being the savior of the world and cease the desperate urge to separate right from wrong. An individual must first empty the self to become like that vacant room, and then simply align with the natural texture of reality. Speak when it is time to speak, and remain silent when it is time for silence. Act when necessary, and abstain when required. Never confront brute force head-on, and never place life in unnecessary peril. This philosophy of worldly survival can be distilled into a single maxim: to recognize what cannot be altered, and to rest in it as destiny. When faced with situations beyond human control, acceptance is not surrender. It is the clear-sighted acknowledgement of limitation. The moment an individual ceases the futile war against fate, fate loses its power to wound the spirit. In the blood-drenched era of the warring states, this strategy of emptiness allowed fragile lives to endure. An individual who lived with such radical clarity would inevitably maintain an equally startling stance toward the ultimate boundary of life and death. When his wife passed away, his friend and intellectual rival, He Zi, came to offer condolences. He found Zhuangzi sitting on the ground, legs sprawled, cheerfully beating a clay pot and singing aloud. He Zi was scandalized. How could a man refuse to weep for the woman who raised his children and grew old alongside him? To beat a pot and sing was an outrage. Zhuangzi replied that at the moment of her passing, he too grieved. Yet upon reflection, he saw that in the very beginning, she possessed neither life nor form, nor even the faintest breath. Out of the vast, shifting void of the cosmos, a subtle transformation brought forth breath. Breath condensed into form, and form quickened into life. Now, another transformation had simply carried her back to death. This sequence of changes is as natural and seamless as the progression of the 4 seasons. She now rests peacefully within the grand chamber of the cosmos, and to wail and sob over her would be a profound ignorance of the cosmic order. Therefore, he ceased his weeping. Zhuangzi did not preach heartlessness. He refused to be held hostage by emotional attachment. Life and death are natural progressions, just as a blossom must eventually fall. To rejoice only in the blooming and mourn only the withered petal is to ensure that inner peace remains forever enslaved by external currents. As Zhuangzi himself neared death, his disciples began planning a lavish burial for him. Zhuangzi smiled and told them that he already possessed the universe as his coffin and shroud, the sun and moon as his twin jade discs, the stars as his jewels, and all creation as his funeral procession. What more could they possibly add? When his disciples feared his exposed body would be devoured by crows and ants, Zhuangzi smiled. Above ground, one is eaten by crows. Below ground, one is eaten by ants. Why rob the crows above just to feed the ants below? This was no jest, but a final radical dissolution into the grand order of existence. He did not preach a reckless bravery, but a profound realization. Death is not the enemy of life, but its silent partner, and together they sustain the seamless movement of the way. To resist it is as futile as resisting the transition from day to night. Instead of meeting the end with terror, the awakened mind ceases to cling, allowing the self to dissolve back into the primal current from which it first emerged. During his lifetime, the influence of Zhuangzi paled in comparison to the Confucians and Mohists. He commanded no legions of disciples, operated no powerful organization, and received no patronage from monarchs. He remained a destitute scholar, a former minor official at a lacquer garden, a lonely fisherman along the Po River, and a starving wanderer begging for grain on the streets. Yet over the next 2 millennia, his thoughts permeated the spiritual landscape of China, like water flowing through stone. During the Wei and Jin dynasties, Zhuangzi found his first true disciples. Ji Kang, the spiritual leader of the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove, lived a life that served as a living footnote to the philosopher. Before the executioner's blade fell, he played one final melody, the Guangling San, declaring that this legendary tune died with him. He was not merely plucking strings. He was breathing the very freedom of Zhuangzi. Much of the spiritual core of Chinese art originates from this philosophy. The negative space in traditional landscape paintings is not unfinished canvas, but the visual manifestation of an empty room, channeling the light. In times of adversity, Zhuangzi became the ultimate sanctuary for the Chinese intelligentsia. He wrote, "I'd fain in a straw cloak spend my life in mist and rain." It was not that he despised his exile, recognizing what cannot be altered and resting in it as destiny. When an individual cannot change the environment, the only choice left is to shift the inner lens through which the world is met. In this manner, the philosophy of Zhuangzi took root and echoed through the hearts of generation after generation. To commune alone with the spirit of the universe, yet never look down upon creation. This was the raw confession Zhuangzi left for himself in the chapter The World. This is the self-portrait he painted, a solitary soul traversing the cosmos while maintaining a deep reverence for all living things. He did not rush between kingdoms like Confucius, nor did he debate monarchs like Mencius. He chose a lonelier, quieter, and far longer path. He did not confront his era with sound, but transcended it through silence. He did not alter the world with action, but anchored his soul through thought. 23 centuries have passed, yet the world of Zhuangzi remains untouched. Within the Northern Ocean, the great Pang eternally soars. Inside the butterfly dream, the wings still flutter. Beside the funeral clay pot, the laughter never fades. Zhuangzi left behind no grand monuments, no vast institutions. In a world consumed by chaos, conflict, and the violent obsession with right and wrong, an individual can choose non-contention, refuse the blind race of the worldly currents, and transcend all futile arguments. One can choose to be as soft as water, as free as the wind, and as light as a dream, communing alone with the spirit of the universe. The way of Zhuangzi resides neither in imperial courts nor in sacred texts. It exists in the exact split second when a flower blooms and withers. A silent smile arises, for no reason at all. That is Zhuangzi.